Hello everyone, welcome. This video is based upon a presentation that I did in May at the invitation of the Philosophy Club at Glendale Community College in Glendale, Arizona. I was invited to speak about the Euthyphro dilemma, and so I presented on that, and I thought that I would narrate my slides and put this video up on YouTube to hopefully reach a larger audience. Okay, so again, the topic is the Euthyphro dilemma as applied to divine command theory. A couple things to say about this topic before I begin. One, the Philosophy Club at Glendale actually invited me as part of a two-part series. The first part was a presentation by Matthew Flanagan, who explained what divine command theory is, and then presented some objections to it, and then responded to those objections. So he was presenting about divine command theory by way of defending it, and so I was invited to provide some objections. So the video and the presentation are focused on, the basic kinds of objections that arise for divine command theory, grounded in the Euthyphro dilemma. Now, of course, there are responses to many of the concerns that I'm going to raise here, and for the most part, I'm not going to respond to those concerns. My aim in this presentation isn't to evaluate the responses, right? I'll talk about a couple of them briefly, but only briefly. Again, my goal here is to present the best case I can that the Euthyphro dilemma does provide for serious objections to divine command theory. Okay. So to start with, I need to say some things about the object of my criticism, right? So I am raising objections to divine command theory, but I want to say a little more about what divine command theory is. And what I really aim to do here is distinguish two versions or two kinds of divine command theory that are importantly distinct. And so those versions are, on the one hand, what's often called normative divine command theory, or NDCT, and on the other hand, metaethical divine command theory, or MDCT. So I will discuss each one separately. So normative divine command theory is the claim that there is one supreme normative principle, which is that God's commands are to be obeyed. Right? That's normative divine command theory. God's commands are to be obeyed. Notice that on that theory, this supreme normative principle has to have its source external to God's commands, right? That is, that it is not God's commands that generate this normative principle. Rather, the normative principle is true, and because of that normative principle, we ought to obey God's commands. Now, what that entails is that if normative divine command theory is true, then there is at least one true normative principle that is not grounded in God's commands, namely this principle on screen here, that God's commands are to be obeyed. The metaethical divine command theory says that all moral obligations are grounded in God's commands. So there is no supreme normative principle to the effect that we are to obey God's commands. Rather, it's just that all obligations just are grounded in God's commands. Now, different versions of metaethical divine command theory exist, and these different versions have different ways of accounting for this grounding relation. So Matthew Flanagan, who I mentioned here only because of what I said earlier, his view, which is essentially the same as Robert Adams' view, is that moral obligations are identical to divine commands, right? So that's one account of what this grounding relation is, but you can have other accounts. So, you can say that God's commands cause moral obligations to come into existence. You can say any number of things. I will say that I think that the most plausible and the view that is most commonly defended is the view that is basically Adam's view, that moral obligations are identical to divine commands. Now, one reason for distinguishing between normative and metaethical divine command theory here is as follows. A lot of people bring to this conversation the intuition that as God's creatures, we are obligated to obey him in a similar way to which many believe children are obligated to obey their parents. But this can mislead us if we're not careful to properly distinguish between these two distinct theories, normative DCT and metaethical DCT. Right? As I said, on the normative version, the obligation to obey God isn't grounded in God's command. Right? The supreme moral principle is logically prior to his commands, and that supreme principle has a kind of logical priority to all other normative principles. That's the upshot of calling it supreme. So on normative divine command theory, again, there's at least one moral obligation that is not grounded in God's commands, namely the obligation to obey God. So that intuition I mentioned before, the intuition that we ought to obey God, as his creatures we are obligated to obey him, if it's held to support normative divine command theory, it supports a theory according to which not all moral obligations are grounded in divine commands. But, and here's the upshot, I'm claiming that the Euthyphro dilemma is best understood as a problem for metaethical divine command theory, not normative divine command theory, right? So if you have the intuition that as God's creatures we're obligated to obey him, then that seems to support normative divine command theory, and then this video is not directing its concerns at your theory, right? I'm directing my concerns at the theory that all moral obligations are grounded in divine commands. And so for the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to just use the term divine command theory, and when I do so, or DCT for that matter, I am referring to metaethical divine command theory. So I'm directing my objections against metaethical divine command theory, and for the remainder of the video, when I say DCT, I mean metaethical DCT. All right, so let's get to the Euthyphro problem. As you know, if you're watching this video, or at least as you probably know, the dilemma arises in the context of a dialogue written by Plato, in which the character Euthyphro articulates a view something like the metaethical divine command theory. Obviously, the ancient Greeks were polytheistic, and so there's a different context, and it's not actually clear exactly what Euthyphro intended to defend. But nonetheless, what Euthyphro says is that the pious is what all the gods love, right? Not going to get into what he meant by pious or anything like that, but what's relevant is the question that Socrates raises after Euthyphro says that the pious is what all the gods love. So here's the question, right? Do the gods love the pious because it is pious, or is the pious pious because the gods love it? So I'm going to spend a little time unpacking this question, but first I want to translate it into a monotheistic context. I'm also going to remove the term pious and replace it with the idea of right action. So, translated in this way, the question that Socrates asks becomes, does God command right actions because they are right, or are right actions right because God commands them? Again, if you're watching this video, you're probably familiar with this question, but there are a couple of things that I feel like are important to point out and that will help us understand the objections that I raise, objections to divine command theory that I raise later. So I want to look at the options for answering Socrates' questions, and there are two of them. The first option, which I'll call option A, says that God commands that we perform morally obligatory actions because they are morally obligatory. And notice I changed the term right to obligatory, and there's a couple good reasons for that. One is that the word right is ambiguous between an action that is justified and an action that is obligatory, right? And since the divine command theory, at least as as articulated by Robert Adams, is a theory about moral obligations, it makes sense here to speak about what's morally obligatory rather than right. So again, option A says that God commands that we perform those actions that are morally obligatory because those actions are morally obligatory. Option B says that morally obligatory actions are morally obligatory because God commands that we perform them. So one very important thing to note here is that the word because, while it appears in option A and option B, is actually equivocal across these two options. Right? That is, it doesn't mean the same. The word is indicating something different in option A than it is indicating in option B. So in option A, because is a reason indicator, right? So option A is saying that the reason that God commands obligatory actions is that they are obligatory. So option B, on the other hand, is not using because as a reason indicator, right? Rather, it's indicating an in virtue of relation, right? So on option B, the word because is saying that morally obligatory actions are obligatory in virtue of the fact that God commands that we perform them. Now, this is an important distinction. It's important to recognize this fact about the word because, but there's an additional complication, an additional ambiguity with respect to option A, and that concerns whether the reasons that are being cited or being mentioned are normative reasons or merely motives or motivational reasons, right? So this isn't the place to get into this in too much detail, but the word reason is multiply ambiguous. There are different things that the word indicates. And so for us, what's important is that reasons can indicate motives and they can indicate normative or sometimes called justifying or justificatory reasons. So the issue is whether option A is referring to God's motives or God's normative reasons. So this is a very important issue, but it would be too much of a distraction to get into it in this video. I'm planning a future video about this topic. For now, I'll just say that I think the natural interpretation of option A is that it's indicating God's normative reasons, right? And the interesting problems for divine command theory arise when option A is interpreted in this way. So now that we understand the two options in the dilemma, I'm going to make a further point, the upshot of which is that these two options are mutually exclusive. That is, if you take option A, you can't take option B, and if you take option B, you can't take option A. To do that, I'm going to make two claims. So the first claim is this. If obligatory actions are obligatory in virtue of the fact that God commands that we perform them, then it cannot be that God's reasons for commanding an obligatory action is that it is obligatory. Why think this? Well, I'll give an analogy in a moment, but essentially the idea is that if what makes an action obligatory is that God commands it, then God's commanding has a kind of logical priority to the actions being obligatory, right? Sometimes we can put this in a quasi temporal sense, right? If what makes an action obligatory is that God commands it, then no action is obligatory until He commands it, right? So no action has the feature of being a morally obligatory action or being morally required prior to God's commanding it. But then that means that His reason for commanding it can't be that it's obligatory because it isn't obligatory yet. Again, I'll give an analogy for this in a moment. The second claim is that if God's reason for commanding that we perform an obligatory action is that it is obligatory, then it cannot be that obligatory actions are obligatory in virtue of the fact that God commands them. Again, there is a logical priority issue here. If God's reason for commanding something is that that thing is required, that means that its being required has logical priority over His commanding it. Or again, think about it in the temporal sense. God can't. If God's reason for commanding it is that it's obligatory, then it has to already be obligatory prior to His commanding it. And again, I'll give an analogy for this on the next slide. So the analogy concerns a to-do list, right? So imagine a person has drawn up a list of things that need to be done around the house. And now we ask this question, similar to Socrates' question, is a task on the to-do list because it is something that needs to be done, or is a task something that needs to be done because it is on the to-do list? Right, so the two options here are the reason that a task is on the to-do list is that it is a task that needs to be done, and a task is one that needs to be done in virtue of the fact that it is on the to-do list. Right, so hopefully you see that these options parallel the options in the Euthyphro dilemma. So now let's look at the analogous claims related to the fact that these two options are exclusive, mutually exclusive. So claim 1 says that if a task needs to be done in virtue of the fact that it is on the to-do list, then it cannot be that the reason it is on the list is that it needs to be done, right? If it needs to be done in virtue of the fact that it's on the list, it's being on the list. It must already be on the list before it can be something that needs to be done, and therefore it can't be on the list for the reason that it needs to be done. Second claim is, if the reason that a task is on the to-do list is that it needs to be done, then it cannot be that a task needs to be done in virtue of the fact that it is on the to-do list. Okay, so hopefully that analogy was helpful. Let's return then to the claims with respect to the options in the actual Euthyphro dilemma. Again, they are, if obligatory actions are obligatory in virtue of the fact that God commands that we perform them, then it cannot be that God's reason for commanding an obligatory action is that it's obligatory, and if God's reason for commanding that we perform an obligatory action is that it is obligatory, then it cannot be that obligatory actions are obligatory in virtue of the fact that God commands them. So in other words, the point is, again, the upshot is that the two options of the Euthyphro dilemma are exclusive. If you take option A, you must reject option B, and if you take option B, you must reject option A. It cannot be that both options are true. Okay, so now we can state what the Euthyphro problem is. Right? I'm going to say that the Euthyphro problem is a problem for metaethical divine command theory, and it's a problem that has 4 aspects. So here we go. So here's the problem. If divine command theory is true, that is, if obligatory actions are obligatory in virtue of the fact that God commands that we perform them, then 4 things follow. The first is that morality is contingent. Second, there are counterintuitive possibilities that follow. Third is that morality is arbitrary. And fourth is that morality is normatively irrelevant. Now I'm going to go through each of these 4 individually and say something about them, say why I think they follow from divine command theory, and also why they present problems for divine command theory, and thus give us reason to believe that divine command theory is false. All right, so the first problem says that if divine command theory is true, then morality is contingent. Just a quick note on what contingent means. If something is contingent, then it could be otherwise. Right? The opposite of contingent is necessary. If something is necessary, then it cannot be otherwise. Commonly, it is believed, and I think it's true, that mathematical truths are necessary, therefore non-contingent, but many the facts based on our observations of the world, of the natural world, are contingent. So facts like the particular mass of the Earth, the fact that Biden is president, or what have you, these are contingent facts because they could be otherwise. So what's the problem here? For any of God's actual commands, it is possible that God issues the opposite of his actual commands. Why think that? Well, essentially because God is all-powerful. That is, his power isn't constrained. It's certainly not constrained by anything external to him. Now, it's an interesting question whether we can make sense of constraints that are internal to God. Again, that's a topic that is going to have to be set aside for a different video because it's much too large for this one. I'll just point out that one common response to this problem of contingency on behalf of divine command theorists is that God does have internal constraints. But let me just set that issue aside for now and describe the problem as it at least appears at first glance. Again, the problem is God is omnipotent, and that means he can do anything, right? Anything certainly that's logically possible. Assuming he gives a set of commands, for any one of those commands, it's logically possible that he gives completely the opposite command. So suppose he commands, thou shalt not murder. It seems logically possible that he could have commanded the opposite, namely, thou shalt murder, right? And that goes for all of his commands. And so therefore, all moral facts are contingent, right? If our moral obligations are grounded on God's commands, but all of God's commands are contingent, they could be otherwise, then all moral obligations are contingent, right? So that seems to be the problem. Now that conflicts with a very powerful intuition, namely that at least some moral facts are not contingent. So consider the moral fact that it is wrong to torture a child gratuitously, right? That is a fact that doesn't seem like it could be otherwise. That is, it certainly doesn't seem like it could be obligatory to torture an infant gratuitously, nor does it seem like it could be morally permissible to torture an infant gratuitously. It seems that it must be the case, it's necessary, that it is morally wrong to torture an infant gratuitously. But if divine command theory is true, then for the reasons I just explained, all moral facts, including this one about torturing infants, are merely contingent. Okay, so on to the next issue, which is that if divine command theory is true, then there are counterintuitive possibilities. As I see it, there are 4 distinct kinds of counterintuitive possibilities, so I'll go through each of the 4. The first is that something horrible, like the example I just mentioned, the gratuitous torture of a child, might be morally obligatory. Now you might be thinking at this point, isn't this just the same problem I raised earlier? Isn't this just the contingency problem? And the answer is no. While this problem is connected to the contingency problem, they are distinct, and it's important to treat them separately. So the earlier problem was the problem of mere contingency, and that's just the problem that on divine command theory, it looks like all moral claims are contingent, or at least all claims having to do with our obligations are contingent. Here, with respect to the counterintuitive possibilities, I'm raising specific possibilities that arise because of contingency that are counterintuitive. So it is correct to see that this current issue we're talking about here is connected to the previous issue of contingency, but again, they're distinct, and it is important to treat them separately. For one thing, though I'm not going to get into it here, different kinds of responses to the contingency problem might work for the contingency problem and yet not work for at least all of the counterintuitive possibilities. All right. So they are distinct problems. All right, so let's go on to the next kind of counterintuitive possibility, and that is that something beneficial, like helping the homeless, might be morally wrong, right? That's counterintuitive. It seems like doing things that are beneficial, ceteris paribus at least, are not going to be morally wrong, right? But God could just command that we not ever help the homeless, in which case anytime a person helps the homeless, they would be doing something morally wrong. That's counterintuitive, right? That's a specific kind of thing. It isn't just that specific example, it's the kind of thing that's the problem here, right? The kind doing beneficial things, right? Those kinds of things could be morally wrong on divine command theory. All right, the next counterintuitive possibility is that something innocuous might be morally obligatory. By something innocuous, I mean something that, at least, as we normally think about it, is an action that doesn't have moral implications, right? So I used as an example here eating lunch at 11:30 a.m. And think about that in terms of alternatives. Eating lunch at 11:30 as opposed to noon, or as opposed to 12:30 p.m., right? The idea is that seems innocuous, that if you do that, there's no moral implication to that. Again, ceteris paribus, right? There may be particular days on which it's not a good idea, even for moral reasons, to not eat lunch at 11:30, but a general practice where you eat lunch at 11:30 as opposed to noon is innocuous, right? And intuitively, that's not an action that can be morally obligatory. And yet, on divine command theory, it could be morally obligatory because all that it would take for it to be obligatory is for God to command that we do it, right? So that's counterintuitive. So again, we have this kind of counterintuitive action, or counterintuitive possibilities, and that would be innocuous actions being obligatory. The final kind is sort of the opposite, and that is something innocuous might be morally wrong, right? Again, God could command that we not eat lunch at 11:30, right? Or if you don't like that example, we could think about the example of brushing your teeth 3 times a day, right? My dentists have always said that I should brush my teeth at least twice a day, right? And sometimes they'll say 3 times are good, but twice is what you should do. Even there, I think we don't think that it's a moral failing to neglect to brush your teeth twice a day, right? Certainly if you miss on a day or even 2 days in a row and you only brush your teeth once on those days, that doesn't amount to a moral failing, right? But again, the idea here is that if divine command theory is true, then this innocuous action, brushing your teeth 3 times a day, might be morally wrong, because God could command, thou shalt not brush thy teeth 3 times a day, right? So then the person who does that, who does brush their teeth 3 times a day, is doing something wrong. That is wildly counterintuitive, right? It doesn't seem like that something so innocuous could be morally wrong. Okay, so again, there are 4 kinds of counterintuitive possibilities. It's not just the specific actions that I've talked about here, it's these 4 kinds of actions that generate these counterintuitive possibilities. Next is the problem of arbitrariness. This is frequently mentioned. Unfortunately, the problem of arbitrariness is sometimes confused with the problem of contingency. Again, it's too long. This video is already going to be too long to go into details about that. I've written about this before. I'll put some links in the description to things that I've written about this. But it is, again, important to distinguish the problem of arbitrariness from the problem of contingency. So what is the problem of arbitrariness? Since on option B, that is the option that says that actions are morally obligatory in virtue of the fact that God commands them, in other words, the divine command theory, since on this option, God's reason for commanding an obligatory action cannot be that it is obligatory, then it seems that he has no reason to command one thing rather than another. His choice, therefore, is arbitrary. To say that some choice is arbitrary is just to say that there are no grounds for choosing one thing rather than another, or no reasons that support one choice rather than another. Now, importantly here, remember what I said earlier about the issue of whether or not we're talking about motivational reasons or normative reasons, right? Again, I think that the particularly interesting problem arises, and the more devastating problem arises when we think about what God's normative reasons could be. Now, of course, one response to this arbitrariness problem is to say, well, God does have reasons, right, for his commands. But the natural question to ask about that response is, well, are you talking about motives or are you talking about normative reasons, right? If it's merely motives you're talking about, then the fact that God has motives doesn't really help, because even an evil deity has motives, right? So an evil, all-powerful being might command that we torture babies and might have motives for that. And, he likes hearing babies cry or something like that. But that he has motives doesn't make his command non-arbitrary. I mean, think about this. Even a hiring manager who refuses to hire people of a specific race or gender has their motives, right? They're racist motives or they're sexist motives. But that they have motives doesn't make their choice non-arbitrary. What would make their choice non-arbitrary is that they have normative justification. And of course, with respect to hiring decisions, at least 99.9% of them, race and gender are not grounds. They are not justifying features. They don't justify one choice rather than another. And that's why we say that racial and gender discrimination is arbitrary discrimination. It's arbitrary regardless of whether the person who's making the discrimination or engaged in the discrimination has their motives. Now, again, I'm working on a separate video about this, which hopefully will be out relatively soon, and I'll go into this issue in more detail. Now, therefore, the upshot of this brief aside is that if the response to the arbitrariness problem is that God does have his reasons, then that response must mean that God has his normative reasons for his commands. But then, if that's the case, then we get a different argument. We get a different kind of response on behalf of the critic of divine command theory. And what the critic will say is, well, if God has normative reasons for commanding one thing rather than another, then it's those normative reasons which are going to make the action obligatory, not his commands. Right? His commands are superfluous. The normative reasons would be there completely separate and independent of his commands. They'd be there even if he issued no commands. So what grounds the obligation in that case would be the normative reasons themselves rather than God's commands. Now, someone who defends divine command theory might deny this conclusion, and indeed, I've seen it denied. Right? That's not surprising. A defender of divine command theory might claim that God does have reasons, normative reasons for his commands, but that those reasons cannot be what makes actions obligatory. But for this response to be tenable, this is me talking now, for this response to be tenable, it must be the case that divine commands are normatively significant. But, as I'll now try to show, they're not. This brings us to the last aspect of the Euthyphro problem, the problem of normative irrelevancy. As we just saw, to respond to the problem of arbitrariness, the defender of divine command theory needs to claim that it is not God's reasons for his commands that ground moral obligations, but the commands themselves that do so. On divine command theory, if there were no divine commands, there would be no moral obligations, because in the absence of divine commands, nothing could make an action morally obligatory. But as I will now argue, this has the consequence that morality is normatively irrelevant, since a bare command cannot add anything of normative relevance. Before I get to the argument for this conclusion, a preliminary remark. As a reminder, we are here considering criticisms of the metaethical divine command theory. On this theory, all moral obligations are grounded in divine commands, and there is no supreme normative principle according to which God's commands are to be obeyed. I'll be referring back to this point in what follows. Now, to say that something is normatively relevant is to say that it contributes to our reasons to act, desire, appreciate, etc. And so to say that something is normatively irrelevant is to say that it makes no contribution to our reasons. I will now state a concise version of my argument and then elaborate it. Since divine command theory says that what makes an action morally obligatory is the fact that God commands that we do it, and the fact that God commands something is not normatively relevant, divine command theory implies that what makes an action morally obligatory is something that is not normatively relevant. But this in turn implies that morality itself is normatively irrelevant. So why think this? Why in particular think that the fact that God commands something is not normatively relevant? To see why, let's revisit a notion that I used earlier without defining it, the notion of a bare command. A bare command is a command that is issued in a context in which the commanded, which I will also call the subject of the command, is not under a prior obligation to obey the commander. And this is precisely the situation that we are all in with respect to God's commands according to metaethical divine command theory. Remember the preliminary remark I made a few moments ago. On metaethical DCT, there is no prior obligation to obey God's commands, prior, that is, to divine commands themselves. So on metaethical DCT, there is no prior obligation to obey God. And hence, God's commands are bare commands. Now, the important claim that I will defend is that a bare command to engage in some action phi adds nothing to the reasons already present to engage in phi. By reasons already present, I mean those factors that count in favor of phi-ing that exist prior to any command to phi. We can say that when some factor adds nothing to those reasons, that factor is normatively impotent. So I am saying that bare commands are normatively impotent. We can see that this is so in the case of human commands. Suppose, for example, that I command you, the listener, to give me $10,000. That adds nothing to your reasons for giving me $10,000. Presumably, unhappily for me, you have no reason at all to give me that much money. And this is the important point, my commanding that you give me $10,000 adds nothing to your reasons, so that even after I have issued my command, you still have no reason to give me $10,000. Now, in a military context, things are different, but that's because in a military context, commands are not bare commands. If a commanding officer, an army major say, issues a command to someone under his command, let's say a captain, this entails that the subordinate has a reason to engage in the commanded action, which reason was not present prior to the command. Whatever reasons the captain had prior to the command to perform the action, she now has more reason to do so because of the major's order. But importantly, in a military context, this sort of thing occurs only because members of the military have taken an oath and therefore have a prior obligation to obey the lawful commands of superior officers. By this sort of thing, I mean the phenomenon whereby the commands of an individual can add to the subject of the command's reasons to engage in a particular action. In our current context, I am not your commanding officer, and you have no prior obligation to obey my commands. That is, my command to you is a bare command, and in this context, my command adds nothing to your reasons. I invite you to consider whether this is so in all contexts in which some human person issues a bare command. I believe that if you consider this, you will reach the conclusion that all contexts in which a command adds to the reasons the subject already has to engage in some action are also contexts in which the subject is under a prior obligation to obey the commander. If you can think of any example where this is not the case, please let me know in the comments. The upshot then is that bare commands do not add anything of normative significance to the reasons already present for the subject of the command, but the same is true of bare divine commands. And we can see this when we consider again the counterintuitive possibilities that I mentioned earlier. Think again about the possibility that God commands that we torture an infant gratuitously. What I want to draw attention to here is that even if God did issue such a command, this would make no difference. It would be normatively irrelevant. It could not make a contribution to the moral status of that action. Now, a frequent objection to divine command theory runs something like this. Suppose that God commands that we do something horrible, like torture an infant. Surely this would not make it obligatory to torture an infant. Defenders of divine command theory commonly respond to this objection by pointing out, rightly in my view, that God, since he is essentially loving, would not issue such a horrible command. But, while this response on behalf of the divine command theorist does adequately address part of the problem of counterintuitive possibilities, that is, the part that concerns possibilities involving horrible commands, it fails to come to grips with the force of the objection. The objection is not that God might possibly issue such a horrible command, but rather that even if he did, even if he could, that command would make no moral difference. Once we understand the logic of the objection, we can see that the reply completely misses the point. The point again is that a bare command cannot make a normative difference. Perhaps, however, you think that the impossibility of God's commanding something horrible does adequately address the concern I am raising here. If so, then consider the third or fourth type, of counterintuitive possibility. Instead of imagining God commanding something horrible, consider the possibility that God commands either that we engage in some innocuous action, or that we refrain from doing something innocuous. Suppose, for example, that God commands that we floss our teeth every morning, and also commands that we never floss our teeth in the evening. This, I take it, is possible even for a perfectly loving God. If God issued these commands, then it would be obligatory to floss your teeth every morning, and morally wrong both to neglect flossing your teeth on any given day and to floss your teeth in the evening. But I am not here making the same point that I made when we first considered these counterintuitive possibilities. That is, I am not arguing, or not merely arguing, that it is implausible that the act of flossing one's teeth in the evening is morally wrong. Rather, the point I am making here is that even if God were to issue such commands, those commands would make no normative difference. And we know that it would make no normative difference because we know that the act of flossing one's teeth in the evening could not be morally wrong. A bare command to not floss one's teeth in the evening is perfectly analogous to my bare command that you give me $10,000. Neither command adds anything to the reasons already present. Neither adds anything of normative significance. And it doesn't seem to matter that one command, my command, is the command of a human, whereas the other command is the command of a divine being. In my view, the reason for raising these counterintuitive possibilities in the context of offering objections to divine command theory is that they reveal precisely the point I am making here. We can state this point as follows. What makes an action morally obligatory cannot be that God commands that we perform the action. If that were so, then God can make a horrible action morally obligatory, a beneficial action morally wrong, an innocuous action obligatory, or an innocuous action wrong. Obviously, divine commands cannot do this. They cannot do this because bare commands add nothing to the reasons already present to engage in or refrain from engaging in any particular action. So to finish this aspect of the Euthyphro problem, what we've seen is that a bare command makes no normatively relevant contribution to the reasons we have for doing what we are commanded to do. So since on divine command theory, actions are morally obligatory in virtue of the fact that God commands them, and these commands are bare commands, according to divine command theory, that an action is morally obligatory is normatively irrelevant. Since morality is not normatively irrelevant, divine command theory must be false. I hope that you've enjoyed this video. If you have an objection to anything I've said or have questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Thank you very much for watching.